Hi guys. So thanks for coming. My name is Timur Si Qin. Um, so I'm going to tell you guys about a project that I've been working on for a couple of years, and actually maybe in a different version of it, I've been working on it for maybe 5 years or 6 years or something. But basically, it's this project, New Peace, and the earlier incarnation of it, which was Peace, which kind of grew out of this idea of thinking of a brand as a kind of sculpture that is like one that is expressed in different times and different forms, and you can kind of think of a brand as sort of an ecological object. But the latest version of it, or branding of it, is New Peace. And with New Peace, what I wanted to do and what I'm really interested in is kind of thinking about maybe proposing a new form of contemporary secular spirituality. So just to give you guys some background, I was born in Berlin, and my dad is ethnic Mongolian and my mom is German. And this is me and my grandma in Berlin before the wall came down. And then, so I had this kind of, Chinese, Mongolian, and German background. This is Tiananmen in '88. And then when I was 8, my mom married my stepdad, my ex-stepdad, who was an Apache, and we moved to Arizona. And so I then all of a sudden grew up in Arizona. And the thing that I was, confronted with, or was sort of this difference between these two sides of American culture, which I was exposed to, and especially in Arizona. On the one hand, like native culture, and then also really American West culture, and specifically, it got me thinking about the differences in the religions of these people. And so, being exposed both to Native American religion and as well Christian fundamentalist religion, just really got me thinking about like where did those differences come from. And if you really examine it, what it probably derives from is the difference between foraging societies and sedentary agrarian societies, which is the technical term for hunter-gatherer versus agricultural society. And if you look at, first here's like a timeline of, how long we were foraging versus, how long agriculture has been around. So I think that there's a lot of impact that this previous form of society had on us. But, some of the differences are that like in a foraging society, that you have much less people. And so it's more egalitarian, there's more egalitarian social stratification. And also one interesting thing is that native or shamanic or pagan religions, they're just innately more aware of environmental conditions and their context in the environment. And they also kind of place plants and animals at the same ontological level as humans. And this is not to play into this idea of the noble savage, because that's also something I want to avoid, because everybody was also equally violent, of course. But in contrast to agricultural societies, the food surpluses led to social stratification and this idea of private ownership of nature, all of a sudden, it was not information that was more valuable, but actual material goods and lands. And of course, that also led to things like patriarchy. And of course, part of the religions of agricultural societies, the function of them was to kind of bring together transfamilial bonds, so that different clans could work together towards a common goal. And, if you really think about it, religions are a sort of technology in themselves. They're responses to environments and the conditions of the people. And, one of the legacies of agricultural religion is this idea of dualism. You have this idea of the separation between nature and culture and mind versus body and matter versus consciousness or spirit or subject versus object. And, you can find this in like the Christian Cartesian or the Christianity of Descartes. And, and part of that is this idea that matter is this innate, is this lifeless kind of gray goo, and it's only like God that, gives matter its form and its vitality. But of course, this is not actually true. It's actually matter. Matter is actually innately dynamic. It's self-organizing. It's immanent, meaning that it's everything that we see is kind of created from the dynamism of matter. And it's also irreducible. It's not computational, technically. So even though things are deterministic, you can't predetermine them just innately because of the complexity of reality. And it's also contingent. So, things are always happening accidentally. And today, this legacy of dualism, I think, is really maladaptive for our society. And the reason, it's very clear, is that we're confronted with a new problem, which is climate change. And climate change is a thing that just cannot be interpreted away. It's a material problem. It can't be prayed away. So really what I'm interested in is thinking about introducing, or at least sketching out, a new form of spirituality that is responsive to our contemporary world and our contemporary environment. And so a new piece is this project. And so the core tenets of New Peace are rejection of the old dualisms, so no longer seeing matter as being lesser than consciousness or spirit or whatever, but recognizing that it's immanent, that spirit and consciousness arises from matter. And in doing so, I think that we can re-enchant this idea of the sacred and dynamic matter. And also, I think what's important is also retooling this idea of faith. So faith, well, maybe I'll get back to that later. So I thought that like a way of grounding New Peace was to ground it in observation rather than just arbitrary prophecy. And the observation, the three observations that I identified that I wanted to build it on are this what I call the undivided ground, which is just this idea of immanence, that everything is one, basically, that it's all arising from the one. And secondly, what I call the truth of difference, which is recognizing that it's difference that kind of drives reality. And then third is this retooling of faith. So yeah, to zoom into each one, I already explained the immanence part. So, if you think about what the universe is doing, which is, it started with a lot of hydrogen, and then over time it progressed and differentiated into now, Times Square and us sitting here having a symposium. So really, it's like what the universe is doing through its evolution is like creating difference. And you can think that like maybe difference is actually the point of what's happening in life. And I think that this, this understanding also naturally leads to a new sense of ethics, which is an ethics that's beyond the human, that's no longer about like, that the human is the most important thing, but just recognizing that there's innately to matter and complexity, that there's value in difference itself. This is just a picture I took that I thought was really cool. This is an Apache crown dancer. So just, differences. I think that there's two sort of predictions that I think can be made as well, which is if it's true that difference is innate to complexity and matter, then one, I think like if we ever were to meet extraterrestrials, we would also encounter beings that had to at some point develop a similar ethical space as us, or similar ethical dynamics as us, that like values life in some ways. And I think that if there ever were to be a super intelligent AI, part of that would also recognize this inherent value of difference. And there's even some research to back this up, which is this researcher who came up with a theory or a kind of algorithm that is all about like maximizing its future potential options. And he thinks that this is actually at the very core of intelligence, that like think that consciousness and intelligence is at the root trying to keep open as many doors as possible for itself. So, one thing to note is also that religion is not the same thing as spirituality. Religion is this sort of social system that I think uses spirituality for its source of energy in some ways. But I think it's really important also to kind of think about spirituality in itself. And, spirituality, I think, can be, parts of it are like thinking about or having this feeling of a connection or the oneness. Also this feeling of a humility in the face of scale, like thinking about how small you are in compared to the size and age of the universe. And also this innate sense of respect for life. So, yeah, and I think that if you take science into account and what it's telling us about reality, which is since the 60s or 50s, scientists have had computers, and from having computers, they've been able to like process very complex systems, not like systems that exist in reality. And what they discovered was that, all of what we think of or what we previously thought of was as random is actually inherently and deeply patterned. So, everything from, the Earth and every, even in the stock market, prices are fractal. So there's a fractal dimension to reality and to how matter, the dynamic nature of matter. And I think that there's, another way of saying this is that, is this term morphogenesis. It's like the potential for matter to shape itself. And I think that we can use this idea to kind of think about a new form of faith. Like not one that's like, based on some arbitrary prophecy, or even one that like claims to predict anything, but just one that recognizes that there's some innate order and patterning in reality. Here are just more examples of patterns and systems. And then here are some examples from this social media campaign I did for a new piece. And just to finish it off, this is the VR that's in the back. This is just a little clip. Oops.
What can be a real source for the spiritual today? How can we avoid the dread of a mechanistic nihilism in a secular age? Can there be a true source of the spiritual beyond the contingent being of the human?
Yeah, that's it. Right. So, part of this taking to heart this non-dualism, I think is, leads to, or like it connects with like the ontological turn in philosophy, or the new materialism. And, recognizing this innate dynamic nature to matter opens up the door again to thinking about humans as really just material systems, and that's not in a reductive way, but just in what it actually is. And I think that part of that is recognizing also the power that cognition plays in the consumption of information. Or in other words, like what I'm trying to say is that recognizing the power of design and marketing and how those kinds of dynamics and aesthetics are really keyed into the way that brains work ultimately. And rather than this postmodern idea that or this constructivist idea that marketing and commercial imagery is from the top down kind of brainwashing us. I think that there's definitely both ways discourse there, or back and forth. And I think part of that is also recognizing, I think that there's a political aspect or dimension to it, which is recognizing how these things really affect people, I think a good example, like what Noah and I were talking about earlier, was like, part of like why Trump, I think, is in power is because he really played this marketing game so well over the course of decades, and it really like, planted this narrative into people's minds through marketing and branding. So I think that we really have to kind of take back control, or like recognize that and figure out those dynamics.
Can you explain how religion is technology?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about how, like a stone axe is like the first form of technology that we call technology, right? In many ways, like what religions were doing, they were just certain protocols for how we organize or how we interface with one another and with our environment. Like, like if you think about like ancient Egyptian society, like the pharaoh was like basically a god, and so everybody had to like work for him without any question, and in a sense that was sort of like necessary in that society to build that society. And today, I think we live in a completely different society, but like that protocol or that like set of algorithms is still sort of like floating around. And so I think that we can kind of upgrade that maybe.
It's like early software.
Exactly, yeah.
I know there's an upcoming exhibition next month, and I was wondering if you could talk about what aspect of your piece that will be sort of highlighted.
It's more or less, so basically this whole year I've been doing this launching of this campaign for a new protocol, and the first place was at Art Basel, Hong Kong, where I showed this VR piece, and also a show in Berlin and in Milan as well. But I think in Beijing, which is going to be next month, it's basically going to be another version of this, but also some sculptures. And the sculptures I'm trying to make, I think, are trying to sort of link into this more indigenous aesthetic, but maybe I shouldn't say too much.